lunch hour. The sound of metal trays and distant shouting filled the hall, but Marcus barely heard it. He'd been here 2 days, already marked by eyes that measured weakness. When the bully's boot knocked his tray to the floor, the laughter hit him harder than the kick. But he didn't move, didn't blink. He'd learned long ago that control wasn't silence, it was power. And behind those still eyes was a man who once fought in cages, where one mistake meant you didn't walk out. The bully leaned closer, whispering, "You gonna pick that up, black boy?" Marcus smiled, just once, and when he stood, everything in the room shifted. No shouting, no threats, only movement, quick, sharp, precise. A body hit the floor, then silence. Stay with me until the end, because what he said after that fight revealed why a jiu-jitsu master ended up behind bars. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The first thing you notice about Millbrook Correctional isn't the gray walls or razor wire. It's the noise. Constant, crushing noise that never stops. Metal doors slamming, guards shouting orders, inmates calling out to each other across cells. The sound bounces off concrete until it becomes this thick blanket of chaos that presses down on everything. Marcus Williams heard it all when he walked through those gates, but he processed it differently than most new arrivals. Where others felt panic, he felt calculation. Where they saw chaos, he saw patterns, rhythms, weak spots. Prison has its own language, and Marcus had been studying it long before he ever set foot inside. Not from books or documentaries, but from the streets where he grew up. The same dynamics played out everywhere. Dominance, territory, respect earned through force or fear. The only difference was the walls. But there was something else about Marcus that nobody could see just by looking. Something that would matter more than his size, his background, or the crime that brought him here. For 15 years, he had trained his body and mind in the ancient art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Not the watered-down version taught in suburban gyms, but the real thing. The kind that turns a smaller man into a weapon. The kind that teaches you to stay calm when someone bigger is trying to hurt you. The processing took 6 hours. Fingerprints, photographs, medical checks, and endless paperwork. Marcus moved through it all with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. Guards barked orders, and he followed them without question. Other inmates sized him up as he passed, and he let them look without staring back. There would be time for all of that later. His cell assignment came with a warning from Officer Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who'd seen every type of inmate walk through those doors. "Block C can be rough for new guys," he said, not unkindly. "Keep your head down for the first few weeks. Learn the rules before you try to break them." Marcus nodded, shouldering his thin mattress and regulation bedding. "Appreciate the advice," he said simply. Rodriguez studied his face for a moment. "You got that look," he said finally. "Like you've been in fights before." "Different kind of fights," Marcus replied. "Different rules." "Rules don't matter much in here," Rodriguez said. "Just who's willing to enforce them." The walk to Block C took them through the main yard, where afternoon recreation was winding down. Groups of men clustered around weight benches and basketball courts, their conversations dropping to whispers as Marcus passed. The racial divisions were obvious. Whites in one corner, blacks in another. Hispanics claiming their own space near the fence. Everyone watching everyone else, measuring, calculating, waiting. Near the entrance to Block C, a group of white inmates had gathered around a picnic table. Their leader was immediately recognizable, not because he was the biggest, but because the others deferred to him. Prison tattoos covered his arms and neck, crude symbols that spoke of hatred and violence. This was Derek "Tank" Morrison, though Marcus didn't know the name yet. He only saw another predator marking territory. Tank's eyes locked onto Marcus as he passed, and for just a second, the yard went quiet. It was the kind of moment that happens before something breaks. But Marcus kept walking, and the moment passed. His cell was on the second tier, a concrete box barely large enough for 2 bunks, a toilet, and a sink. His cellmate was already there, an older black man named Jerome who'd been inside for 12 years. Jerome looked up from a paperback book as Marcus entered, taking in the new arrival with experienced eyes. "Fresh fish," Jerome said, not without humor. "How long you got?" 3 to 5, Marcus replied, setting his bedding on the lower bunk. "Aggravated assault." Jerome nodded. "In prison, your crime was your introduction." "Self-defense?" "Something like that." "Always is," Jerome said, going back to his book. "Name's Jerome. Been here since Obama was president. You need to know something about this place. You ask me before you ask anybody else. Could save your life." That first night, Marcus lay on his narrow bunk and listened to the sounds of the prison settling around him. Distant conversations through the walls, the shuffle of feet on concrete. Somewhere, a man was crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with his pillow. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant and unwashed bodies, a combination that would soon become as familiar as breathing. But Marcus didn't feel the despair that consumed so many new inmates. His mind was already working, cataloging information, understanding the environment. This wasn't his first time being outnumbered and surrounded by people who wanted to hurt him. The principles were the same whether you were facing one opponent on a mat or 100 in a cell block. Stay calm. Watch for openings. Never let them see fear. The next morning brought his first real test. The mess hall was a football field of tables where men ate in careful clusters, alliances and enemies clearly marked by seating arrangements. Marcus took his tray, watery eggs, burnt toast, coffee that looked like motor oil, and scanned the room for an empty spot. That's when he saw Tank Morrison again, holding court at a table near the center of the room. The white supremacist was telling some story that had his followers laughing, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every face, every movement. When those eyes found Marcus, they lingered. Marcus found a seat at an empty table near the back wall, positioning himself where he could see most of the room. Jerome had warned him about eating alone. It marked you as either dangerous or weak, and until people figured out which, you were a target. But Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes the best defense was making people wonder. He ate slowly, methodically, aware of the conversations dropping to whispers around him. New inmates were always a source of curiosity, but something about Marcus seemed to generate more interest than usual. Maybe it was his size, 6'2" and solid without being massive. Maybe it was the way he moved, controlled and deliberate. Or maybe it was something less tangible, a quality that some men carried that made others want to test them. Whatever it was, Marcus knew it wouldn't take long to manifest. Prison was like a living organism, constantly probing for weakness, constantly testing boundaries. And test him they would. He just hoped they were ready for what they'd find. The test came on his second day, just as Marcus knew it would. Lunch period had that familiar tension, the kind that builds right before something breaks. Marcus carried his tray through the maze of tables, eyes scanning faces that had already started to categorize him. In prison, you were either predator or prey within the first week. There was no middle ground. He found his spot at the same back table, positioning himself with his back to the wall. The routine felt natural now. Eat methodically. Stay aware. Never show weakness. Jerome had given him more advice that morning, speaking in the low tones that carried wisdom earned through years behind bars. "That boy Tank been asking questions about you," Jerome had whispered during morning count. "Wants to know what you did on the outside. Wants to know if you got people watching out for you in here." Marcus had nodded, unsurprised. Predators always tested new arrivals. It was biology, pure and simple. The strong established dominance early, and the weak learned their place. What Tank didn't understand was that Marcus had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The approach came from behind, deliberate and theatrical, heavy footsteps that wanted to be heard. Tank Morrison and 3 of his followers moving through the mess hall like they owned every inch of concrete. Conversations died as they passed. Even the guards seemed to find somewhere else to look. Marcus felt them before he saw them, that shift in air pressure that happens when violence enters a space. He continued eating, fork moving steadily from tray to mouth, but every muscle in his body had gone alert. His breathing stayed deep and controlled, the way his instructor had taught him years ago. In Jiu-Jitsu, panic was death. Tension was weakness. Only calm survived. "Well, well," Tank's voice carried across the sudden quiet. "Look what we got here. Fresh meat eating all alone." The mess hall had gone silent now, hundreds of men sensing what was about to unfold. Some turned in their seats to watch. Others kept their heads down, grateful they weren't the target. The guards at the front of the room seemed occupied with paperwork, their backs conveniently turned. Marcus took another bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. Then he set down his fork and looked up. Tank stood directly behind his table, arms crossed, prison tattoos writhing across his biceps. His followers had spread out slightly, blocking potential escape routes. Classic pack behavior. "You deaf, boy?" Tank asked, leaning forward. "I'm talking to you." "I hear you," Marcus said quietly. His voice carried no fear, no anger, just acknowledgement. Tank's eyes narrowed. He'd expected either defiance or submission. This calm indifference threw him off balance, and Marcus could see the confusion flicker across his face. In prison, emotions were weapons. If you couldn't read someone's emotional state, you couldn't control them. "See, here's the thing," Tank continued, his voice getting louder. "You been here 2 days, and you ain't paid your respects. You ain't introduced yourself proper. That's disrespectful." Marcus nodded slowly. "Didn't know there was protocol?" "Oh, there's protocol," Tank grinned, and his followers chuckled on cue. "First thing is, you gotta understand the hierarchy. You see, in here, we got an order, and right now, you at the bottom of that order until you prove otherwise." The conversation was ritual, Marcus realized. Theater for the audience that surrounded them. Tank needed to establish dominance publicly, needed witnesses to see him put the new inmate in his place. It wasn't personal. It was business. "What kind of proof you looking for?" Marcus asked. Tank's grin widened. He reached down and placed both hands flat on Marcus's table, leaning his weight forward. The move was designed to intimidate, to make the target feel small and trapped. "Well, for starters, you can stand up when I'm talking to you. Show some respect." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the mess hall held its breath. Even the cooks had stopped moving behind the serving line. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Stand up, and he'd be marked as compliant. Refuse, and the violence would start immediately. Marcus stood up slowly, deliberately. But as he rose, something changed in his posture. His shoulders squared. His feet found their balance. His hands hung loose at his sides, ready. To most observers, it looked like submission. But to anyone who understood fighting, it was something else entirely. Better, Tank nodded. Now here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna give me that cornbread there. And tomorrow, you're gonna save me your dessert. And next week, when commissary opens up, you're gonna put some money on my books. Call it a protection fee. Marcus glanced down at his tray, then back up at Tank. And if I don't? The question hung in the air like smoke. Tank's followers shifted nervously. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. New inmates either paid up immediately or tried to run. They didn't ask follow-up questions. Tank's face darkened. If you don't, then me and my boys here are going to teach you some manners. Might take a few lessons before you learn. Marcus nodded as if considering the offer. Around them, the mess hall had become a theater. Every eye focused on this drama playing out in real time. Some inmates were already placing silent bets on the outcome. Others were calculating how this would shift the prison's power dynamics. I appreciate the offer, Marcus said finally, but I think I'll pass. The words dropped like a stone into still water. Tank's face went through several expressions before settling on rage. His followers took half steps forward, waiting for the signal. Even the guards seemed to sense something building, though they still hadn't turned around. You think you're tough? Tank asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. You think because you got some size on you, you can disrespect me in my house? Marcus shrugged. I think I'm going to finish my lunch. He started to sit back down, and that's when Tank made his move. His boot came up fast, aimed at the edge of Marcus's tray. The metal flew through the air, food scattering across the floor in a spray of mashed potatoes and gravy. The crash echoed through the silent mess hall like a gunshot. Marcus looked down at the mess, then back up at Tank. His expression hadn't changed. No anger, no humiliation. Just that same calm assessment, like he was watching something interesting happen to someone else. Oops, Tank said with mock concern. Looks like you dropped your lunch, boy. Better clean that up. That's when Marcus smiled. Just once. Small and cold and completely without humor. And when he stood up this time, everything in the room shifted. The movement happened faster than most could process. Marcus didn't telegraph anything. No wind-up, no warning. One moment Tank was standing over him, grinning with satisfaction. The next, he was airborne. Marcus had stepped inside Tank's reach while simultaneously grabbing his wrist and collar. The technique was called an ippon seoi nage, a judo throw that uses an opponent's weight against them. Tank's momentum carried him up and over Marcus's shoulder before gravity took control. The sound of his body hitting the concrete floor echoed through the mess hall like thunder. But Marcus wasn't finished. As Tank tried to scramble to his feet, dazed and confused, Marcus moved again. This time it was pure Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He dropped to the ground beside Tank, slipping his arm around the bigger man's neck in a rear naked choke. Tank's hands clawed desperately at Marcus's forearm, but the technique was already locked in. Blood flow to the brain was being restricted. Consciousness had maybe 10 seconds left. The entire sequence had taken less than 15 seconds. Tank's 3 followers stood frozen, unsure whether to help their leader or run. The mess hall had become a tomb. Hundreds of men holding their breath as they watched a prison legend get dismantled by someone they'd never heard of. Marcus held the choke just long enough to make his point, then released it. Tank gasped and coughed, rolling onto his side as oxygen flooded back into his system. His face was red and confused, like a child who'd just learned that gravity was real. "Stay down," Marcus said quietly. His voice carried no emotion, no triumph, just fact. Tank tried to speak but only managed to croak. His reputation, built over years of intimidation and violence, had evaporated in front of everyone who mattered. In prison, respect was currency, and he'd just gone bankrupt. Marcus stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his uniform. He looked around the mess hall, making eye contact with faces that would remember this moment for years. Some showed fear. Others showed respect. A few showed calculation, already wondering how this shift in power might benefit them. The guards finally turned around, drawn by the unnatural silence. Officer Rodriguez was the first to reach them, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. Tank on the ground, breathing hard, his followers backing away slowly. Marcus standing calm and composed, like nothing had happened. "What's going on here?" Rodriguez demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Slipped and fell," Marcus said simply. "Clumsy." Tank was finally getting to his feet, supported by one of his followers. His eyes were clearer now, but filled with something new. Not just anger, understanding. He was looking at Marcus like he was seeing him for the first time. Rodriguez looked between them, clearly aware that more had happened than anyone was admitting. "Morrison, you need medical attention?" Tank shook his head, still staring at Marcus. "Nah, just lost my balance." "Uh-huh." Rodriguez's expression said he'd heard that story 1,000 times. "Well, maybe you should be more careful where you walk. Floors can be dangerous." The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in whispers. But the energy had changed completely. Where before Marcus had been an unknown quantity, now he was something else. Someone who could take down Tank Morrison without breaking a sweat. Someone who fought with skills they'd never seen before. As Marcus walked toward the exit, Jerome fell into step beside him. The older man's face showed a mixture of admiration and concern. "Son," Jerome said quietly, "you just changed everything in this place." Marcus nodded. "Had to happen eventually. Tank ain't gonna let this slide. He can't. Too many people saw it. I know." They walked in silence until they reached the corridor leading back to their cell block. Other inmates moved aside as they passed, creating space that hadn't existed before. Word was already spreading through the prison's invisible network. By dinner time, everyone would know what happened. By tomorrow, the story would be legend. "You mind me asking," Jerome said as they climbed the stairs, "where you learned to fight like that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Started when I was 12, he said finally. "My mom scraped together enough money to pay for classes at this little gym in our neighborhood. Said she was tired of me coming home with black eyes from kids who thought I was an easy target. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Started with that. Added some judo, some wrestling. Spent 15 years on the mats. Competed nationally. Even fought professionally for a while." Marcus's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "Turns out those skills transfer pretty well to other situations." They reached their cell, and Marcus sat heavily on his bunk. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving him feeling drained. He'd hoped to avoid this kind of confrontation, But prison had its own rules. Sometimes violence was the only language that got through. Jerome settled onto his own bunk, studying his cellmate with new eyes. Professional fighting, huh? What happened? Why'd you stop? Marcus was quiet for so long that Jerome thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I killed someone." The words hung in the cell like smoke. Jerome felt his breath catch. In prison, everyone had their story. Everyone had done something to end up here. But hearing it said so plainly, so matter-of-factly, still had the power to shock. "The ring?" Jerome asked carefully. Marcus shook his head. "Outside. A fight that got out of hand. Guy was harassing my sister at her job. Wouldn't take no for an answer. Followed her home one night." His hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. "I went to talk to him. Just talk. But he threw the first punch. Self-defense? That's what I thought. But when you know how to fight the way I do, the law sees it differently. The prosecutor said I used excessive force, said my hands were weapons and I should have known better." Marcus looked up at Jerome, his eyes holding years of regret. "Maybe he was right. Maybe I should have just called the cops. Let them handle it." Jerome was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "How long did the fight last?" "Maybe 30 seconds. He swung at me, missed. I took him down, put him in a chokehold. Same one I used on Tank today." Marcus's voice got even quieter. "But I was angry. Really angry. Thinking about what he'd been putting my sister through. And I held it too long." The cell fell silent except for the distant sounds of the prison around them. Guards making their rounds. Inmates calling out to each other. The constant background noise that never stopped. "Your sister know you're in here because of her?" Jerome asked gently. Marcus nodded. "She blames herself. Writes me letters every week, talking about how sorry she is, how she never asked me to get involved." He pulled a worn envelope from under his mattress, handling it like something precious. "I keep telling her it was my choice, my mistake, but she doesn't believe me." "What's her name?" "Keisha. She's a nurse now. Got her degree while I was waiting for trial. Says she's gonna help people the right way. Not like her brother who solves problems with violence." There was pride in his voice, mixed with pain. "She's everything good in this world. And I'm in here because I couldn't control myself when someone threatened that goodness." Jerome leaned forward on his bunk. "You saved her, Marcus. Maybe it cost you. But you saved her. That man would have hurt her eventually. You know that, right?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Sometimes I wonder if there was another way. If I'd just been smarter, more patient. Maybe I could have handled it without anyone getting hurt." "Maybe," Jerome said. "But you can't live in maybe. You can only live in what is. And what is that your sister is safe, and you're here paying the price for keeping her that way." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside their cell, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Both men went quiet, listening. In prison, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. The footsteps stopped outside their door. "Williams!" a guard's voice called out. "You got a visitor." Marcus and Jerome exchanged glances. It was unusual for new inmates to get visitors so quickly, especially in the middle of the day. "Who is it?" Marcus asked. "Warden wants to see you. Now." Marcus stood up slowly, every inmate in the corridor turning to watch. Getting called to see the warden after what happened in the mess hall could mean solitary confinement. It could mean extended sentence. Or it could mean something worse. Move it, Williams, the guard said impatiently. Jerome caught his eye as Marcus stepped toward the cell door. Keep your head straight, the older man whispered. Whatever this is about, don't give them more ammunition. The walk through the prison felt different now. Word had spread faster than Marcus expected. Inmates who'd never looked at him before now stepped aside as he passed. Some nodded with respect. Others watched with calculation, already wondering how to use this new information to their advantage. The guard escorting him was Officer Chen, someone Marcus hadn't dealt with before. Young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of rigid posture that screamed military background. He walked 2 steps behind Marcus, close enough to react, but far enough to avoid any sudden movements. First time seeing the warden? Chen asked as they navigated the maze of corridors. Yeah. Word of advice. Don't volunteer information. Answer what he asks, nothing more. Warden's been here 20 years. He's seen every game, every angle, every sob story twice. Marcus nodded, appreciating the guidance even if he didn't fully trust it. In prison, information was currency, and he couldn't figure out why this guard was spending his so freely. They passed through 3 security checkpoints, each one requiring Chen to radio ahead and state their business. The deeper they went into the administrative section, the quieter it became. Gone were the constant echoes of voices and slamming doors. Here, the walls seemed thicker, the air cleaner. This was where the real power lived. The warden's office sat at the end of a carpeted hallway that felt surreal after days of concrete and steel. Chen knocked twice, waited for permission, then opened the door. Williams to see you, sir. Warden Patricia Hawthorne looked up from a stack of papers, her steel-gray eyes taking in Marcus with the kind of assessment that came from decades of reading dangerous men. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'6", but she carried herself with authority that filled the room. Her office walls were covered with commendations, photographs with politicians, and a single framed newspaper clipping that Marcus couldn't read from this distance. Have a seat, Williams. Her voice was crisp, professional, neither friendly nor hostile. Marcus sat in the chair across from her desk, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. Chen remained by the door, hand resting casually near his radio. Hawthorne set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. Interesting first week you're having. Yes, ma'am. Morrison's been here 4 years, built quite a reputation for himself. Runs a tight crew, keeps his people in line, rarely causes problems for my staff. She paused, studying Marcus's face. Until today. Marcus waited. Chen had been right about not volunteering information. 3 witnesses say Morrison slipped and fell during lunch. Clumsy accident. Hawthorne's tone suggested she found this explanation amusing. But my cameras tell a different story. The words hit Marcus like cold water. He'd been focused on the inmates watching. Hadn't considered the security cameras positioned throughout the mess hall. In the outside world, cameras were everywhere but easy to forget. In prison, they were survival tools for the administration. I see you understand the situation now, Hawthorne continued. Would you like to revise Morrison's story? Maybe add some details about how exactly he became so clumsy? Marcus kept his expression neutral. I was eating lunch. Morrison approached my table. He seemed unsteady on his feet. Hawthorne smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. You know what I find interesting, Williams? Your file. She opened a folder on her desk, scanning pages that Marcus couldn't see. High school graduate. 2 years of community college before you dropped out to work construction. Supported your mother and sister after your father died. Clean record until the incident that brought you here. She looked up. No gang affiliations, no prior violence. Model citizen right up until you killed a man with your bare hands. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. But that's not the interesting part, Hawthorne continued. The interesting part is buried on page 3 of your background check. 15 years of martial arts training, multiple tournament wins, professional fighting record of 8 wins, 2 losses. She closed the folder. That prosecutor was right to call your hands weapons. Question is, why didn't you use them sooner? Marcus met her gaze steadily. Because violence should be the last option, not the first. Is that what your instructor taught you? Among other things. Hawthorne leaned forward slightly. What else did he teach you? The question felt loaded, like there was a right answer and several wrong ones. Marcus thought about Professor Santos, the Brazilian master who'd taken a scared 12-year-old and taught him not just how to fight, but when to fight, and more importantly, when not to. Control, Marcus said finally. He taught me that strength without control is just destruction. That the goal isn't to hurt someone. It's to end the conflict with the least damage possible. And today? Was that control? Marcus considered the question carefully. Tank Morrison was twice his size and had 3 allies backing him up. A traditional fight would have been chaos, potentially involving dozens of inmates before the guards could restore order. People would have been seriously hurt. Morrison was establishing dominance through intimidation and humiliation. In that environment, backing down would have marked me as prey for every predator in this place. But escalating to a brawl would have gotten people hurt unnecessarily. Marcus paused. I ended the conflict quickly, with minimal damage, and sent a clear message about boundaries. Hawthorne nodded slowly. Minimal damage. Morrison has a bruised ego and some sore ribs. Could have been much worse. Yes, ma'am. You could have broken his neck with that chokehold. Yes, ma'am. But you didn't. No, ma'am. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus with those sharp eyes. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted slightly. Marcus walked back to his cell that afternoon, knowing everything had changed. The warden had given him a choice: help train corrections officers in defensive techniques, or spend his remaining sentence watching his back every day. The skills that put him behind bars had just become his ticket to something better. That night, he wrote to his sister for the first time since arriving. I finally understand what Professor Santos meant, he wrote. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose not to destroy someone when you have the power to do it completely.